the privilege of chairing the G20 this year. And there are many people here, private sector, governments, who are hoping that because you're in this pole position, you can advocate for the extension of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, quota-free, tariff-free access to the US market, in a time when the opposite is happening. And in your case, have you even been able to convince President Trump to show up?
Well, there's still a long time from now to November, and a number of discussions will be ensuing. And so the G20 process consists of 130 meetings the whole year, and we participate with a number of countries, and the US also participates, and leading to that summit where we will, as South Africa, hand over to the United States. One would hope that it will all happen seamlessly and in an ordinary and well-managed manner. So we will see how this whole process will end up. But we are excited as South Africa, and very privileged to be heading the G20 for the very first time on the African continent, and we're particularly pleased that our own continent as a whole, through the AU, is now a member and will be participating fully as we get the world to discuss our priorities and our theme, which is solidarity, equality as well. And as we do all that, we expect that our key priorities will become top of mind in the discussions that are currently taking place leading up to the Leaders Summit in November.
Thank you, Mr. President. And we are joined on the stage as well by His Excellency Mohamed Ould Ghazouani, President of Mauritania. I'll come back to that in just a second, President Ramaphosa. But President Kagame, when we spoke in February, at the beginning, shortly after President Trump took over power, you said you supported the cuts to aid, that we as Africans have to be self-dependent. We can't rely on other people to fund our development. A lot more has happened since then that in some ways threaten our economic advantage as Africans. Do you still support largely what President Trump is doing in resetting our relationship with America and forcing us as Africans to step up?
Well, thank you, Rari. I think we have to put everything in a context. Whatever President Trump has decided, or whatever anybody else will decide in the near future, there is a history to how we've been going about things for decades as Africa. So it isn't like we should just wake up one morning and because of what somebody has done that affects us, we should have been building up the momentum in terms of what we need to do to make Africa self-dependent and resilient, and also in how Africa works with other continents and other countries. So that is the context. So in this case, it is as well that President Trump decided to do what he did. If that was only to add to many other reminders or things that should wake us up to, as Africa, be able to do what we ought to do. And there are many opportunities. We always talk about potential of our continent. But when do we realize really what this potential is all about in reality? I think that has always been the question. And that comes back to us as a continent, as a people of this continent, to take the bull by its horns and deal with the problem. So we can't keep depending on what others are saying or doing about us. We need to be working with each other and other countries on the global stage that offer what we need, and we as well offer what they need. I think this is the context.
You have been an advocate, President Kagame, of reforming the African Union. Is it, as currently set up, the vehicle for us, our aspirations as Africans, when, for instance, you've been critical of its role in mediating in the conflict that you have with your neighbor in the DRC, in the Rwanda process, in the Nairobi process, and the best results appear to have come from one meeting you had with President Tshisekedi in Qatar. So the African Union failed there and Qatar succeeded.
Well, I think there are several efforts going on at the same time. That's the problem. And even that one we are talking about, whether it is Qatar or the US, or we can't say we have succeeded. Everyone is trying. And again, it comes back to us, really. If you look at what we've been doing on our continent, much progress has been made. I think we can't say nothing has been done, generally. Whether it was to do with the reforms, and I think Africans have come together. They have defined things and they speak with one voice increasingly. There is significant progress. But most of these developments that have been happening in the last decade, as I said, remind us that there are things we need to do that we haven't done. So if you look at it at the African Union level, I remember when I was the champion of the reform process, there are things that were discussed on the continent. For example, the peace and security facility that was put in place. Because it was put in place to avoid being fully dependent on external funders, because that has been the case. In fact, this is similar to what happens in other areas in different countries. We find we depend so much on the external partners and forget ourselves to put in place what we really have to do and can do. So that is progress. And then, so in terms of peace and security, and again, you look at the whole continent, you find there are many trouble spots in different areas. All kinds of efforts going on, back and forth, succeeding in some places, not succeeding in others, and continued efforts going on. Again, these are some of the areas, because of the past and how we have handled our own affairs, that we are all of a sudden reminded that we can't do all things by ourselves,
right,
and revert to these partners. In other words, in any case, it doesn't, even if we're able to do things ourselves, we still have to bring in partners who have what to offer. But we have, as Africa, to be able to define which direction you want to take and not entirely depend on what these people are contributing.
All right. President Ramaphosa, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, on the peace process, particularly in the conflict that's been happening on our continent and particularly in the Eastern DRC, I'd like to compliment rather than contradict what President Kagame is saying. The processes that have been happening on the continent, either the Nairobi process or the Rwanda process or the AU process, have been very, very essential in building a foundation of peacemaking and also confidence building, up to and including agreements that have been reached for a ceasefire between the belligerents, up to and including the withdrawal of, say, the SADC forces as they are withdrawing now. I mean, people may think that President Kagame and I are in conflict and Some of you may have thought that there's going to be fireworks as we're sitting close to each other.
It is wonderful to see you agreeing and not contradicting each other. You're all thinking it.
So all these efforts have been building a very strong and firm foundation. And of course, because our countries on the continent are not islands, we don't live alone in this God-given world or planet. We have to interface and interact with others. So whatever contribution others can make who are extra African is important. But in the end, we must also remember the principle that we have adopted as Africa, that African problems or African solutions for African problems. In the end, and President Kagame knows this, whatever discussions are happening, in the end has to be endorsed, signed off, and owned and appropriated by us as Africans. Because this is our continent. We are in charge of the future of this continent, and we must build peace ourselves because we live on this continent, and therefore we have a deep responsibility to ensure that peace does indeed prevail. And what they are doing with Qatar, US, or whoever is part of the peace-building process, but it is inherently African. And we must thank and applaud those who are assisting because they are our partners, but we are the owners of the whole process ourselves as Africans.